He's going to talk about twist neutrality and topological aspects of nucleosomal DNA. Jakob.
Thank you. How do you do? Good. Yeah, my name is Jakob Bohr. I come from the Technical University in Denmark at what's called nanotech, which means the Department for Nanotechnology and Microtechnology. I'm here today to tell you about some results that my co-worker Kasper Olsen and I have thought about for the geometry and also topological results, some of them for the nucleosomes. I'm thankful to the Newton Institute for holding this great meeting, for the organizing committee for organizing it, and I'm pleased that you are here to listen. And I also welcome everyone out in the space from the camera in the back. So here is my co-worker. We are working here on a model of collagen, also a helical structure. You see this figure here in other versions in many of the talks, particularly the first day. And this is this one is probably the least precise, but it's just intended to be an artist's impressions of it. And of course, the reason I've taken it and we have it drawn is that we all really want to know what's going on here. And so I hope in the next 5, 10, 15 years we will have both complete experimental data and also models of this. But for now, we'll just stand down here in the low end where we know a little bit. And there are some features I'd like to discuss with this figure already here. For example, they're all superstructures of the DNA, which is a helical structures. That means they're all chiral structures. So they do not have a mirror symmetry. There's no plan of mirror symmetry in these structures. So if you take a chiral structure like that, and if you pull in it, with the lack of the symmetry, it will in general rotate. So in fact, there was a paper some years ago by Barbie and Victor and et al. From Paris who have made a model of chromatin. When you pull in it, it doesn't rotate this particular model. I also noticed in the very beautiful model from the sixth in the first talk at the meeting that these chromatin fibers that was kind of elongated and then collapsed into fibers again, that didn't rotate while it was doing this. Not much, at least. I didn't see it. So I was very pleased with this concept that it doesn't rotate. I will come back to this in the talk. It's going to be an important concept. There's another thing that comes to my eye here as surprising that I'm going to talk about today. And that is if you look at the nucleosomes here. All of the nucleosomes are 11 nanometer in diameter. That means they're all the same size. Why is there no evolutionary pressure for generating some that are 20? Some organisms have nucleosomes that are 20 nanometers in diameter. After all, it's just a way of compaction of DNA. You roll it around a cylinder, so to say, at least in the most primitive way of looking at it. So it seems that seems surprising, and that's what I'm hoping today, that you can, after the talk, would think that there's at least a serious attempt to try to understand this. Why, and also suggestion for why the nucleosomes have not diverged in size with evolutions. So of course here we have the nucleosome. I just have to have my notes here. Not because I can look at them, because then I need the other set of glasses, but just because without them I get nervous. So essentially, what you already know here. You have to. I talked about 110 angstrom, which is from the outer part. I'm going to talk mostly about the path of the DNA, which is more like 84 angstroms in diameter or so. So this is what the agenda. And then also we live in the time of kind of the paradigm of the sequence. So all I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk is going to be pre-sequence. So let's see if we can still learn something pre-sequence. So I already addressed the question. So in order to answer the question, I'm going to suggest two things. That we have a principle for the packing of DNA that applies locally, and then a principle that determines the coiling. So in that sense, we have both a local principle and a global principle, and then it turns out we have enough to come up with a model. To do that, I need to take you back to very simple helixes. And just look at the helixes again. So I'm going to look at generic double helixes here, just like tubular helixes. You see some of them are open space here. I'm going to let the steric interaction be determined from what I'm going to tell you in the next 10 minutes. And therefore I'm going to look only at helixes where the two helixes are in contact. I call these packed helixes. And you see this one here. If you let the pitch angle, which is the rays of the helix, go down to 0, the diameter spreads out enormously. So essentially that would not be a fruitful strategy. So let's just look at the diameter of the helix. We have it right here. Until 45 degrees, it stays constant, and then it is just because of the steric interaction forced to increase rapidly. Now I want to say something about what we call the volume fraction. And the volume fraction has something to do with that we now consider all these helices, they're packed in the sense they touch each other, but they don't use space equally efficient. The question is, which of the helices uses space most efficient? And to do that, I make a reference volume here, which is an enclosing cylinder, and just compare the volume of the reference volume with that of the helix. And of course, as the helix diameter changes, the enclosing cylinder diameter changes. Then I can get a volume fraction that's just the mean value of the density. And you may remember from the volume fraction for close packing of spherical particles it's 0.74, which is the Kepler number. So anyway, here is for helixes, it's the blue line, the volume fraction. And you see there is a clear pronounced maxima. It's also quite broad, but it's about 38 degrees. So let's see how is it for DNA. Here's how it is for DNA, and I made out the numbers, but you just have to trust me here that the vertical line here is for DNA A. And it's pretty close to agree with this principle. So I don't even have the base pairs involved here. But you should notice that it's under 45. That means that it has opened up space in the center for base pairs to be put. So one could say a base pair may be an adaptation to that channel rather than the vice versa. Of course, we don't know that. How is it for DNA B, which is more relevant? You have to look at the green line here, and you see again, this is DNA B. It fits pretty perfectly. You can see here the ratio of volume fraction 0.998, 1.00 for DNA B. It's very close to be optimized. So I will now make the assumption that I can use this as a local parking for helixes. And this is just to remind you, I think I already mentioned Kepler. We don't have many more words to give to him. But close parking of space is a common phenomenon. Nearly half of the elements in the periodic table close park, whether they're metals or noble gases or whatever. But we need to get to the second principle. So I will use the volume fraction as the first principle. For the second principle, we had a talk earlier today that it's important to keep track of the direction of the twist or the rotation of the DNA. And of course, this is particularly easy for helix because there's no there's no twist associated with the space curve. It's just a straight line. So it's easy mathematically. So I just write that up, and then I ask for the volume fraction is just dh is the pitch, and now we have instead the incremental twist, how much it twists, and we take the differentiation with that with the pitch and see what comes. See if it goes this way, yes, and it comes right here. It has a curve here. So this is the incremental twist here. Here's the twist normalized to length, and then there's to make it independent of dimension the diameter. So anyway, here's how it is. The pitch angle here, and you see if I go from, for example, 90 pitch angle, start with 2 straight rods and then twist them down, you can see that I come to a maximum point where it cannot be twisted anymore. So there's a maximum point which is here called zero twist. On the next slide it will be through why one could also call it maximally twisted for that point. And then if I go beyond that point, then it begins to be less twisted. And I have numbers here. For a double strand, the zero twist point is 39.4 degrees. The point for the closed parking was 32.5. So here is just, if I take the differentiation of the curve, so we can define what's called overwinding. This is inspired by the work of Bohr and Leonid et al., 2 independent groups. 5 minutes, thank you. And you just see here that it naturally explains DNA was below 39, it was 32 here. These are for symmetric helixes, but anyway, it's naturally explained that this one overwinds, whether a tightly twisted, which was 45 degrees, would just unwind. So there's no additional need for additional interaction, just a steric interaction in the double helix to get overwinding of DNA. Now we have to look at helixes that bend. And then of course what happens when a helix bends? This is a single helix, but never mind that. You can see there that as it begins to bend, of course the steric interaction becomes more restricted, closed in here, and that means that it has to expand on the outside. That means that the effective pitch is increased. And we have to redo the calculations that we did before. So instead of doing what I had before, a straight helix, I now have a reference volume, which is a section of a torus ring. And then I get the following plot here. And what I have here is the zero curvature. That's a straight DNA. The red line is the closed packed line. So because of the steric interaction, I'm forced to having a higher pitch as I go up. This was a zero twist point, and it also increases if I keep track of how it rotates when I bend more and more. And you can see here they meet. So there is a possibility here for having these two, for having a structure that is both rotationally neutral, that is under strain, it will not rotate, even if I put 100 of them on top of each other and try to pull. And at the same time, it's packed after this closed packing principle. And that's essentially the story behind the nucleosome. I would like to show this one. There's just a minute here, just to show a funny thing, because I haven't used base pairs so far. For base pairs, there's no base pair in this calculation other than reading of the table what the incremental raises per base at the zero bend of the torus. And then you can calculate this just from the steric interactions. And you see here on the point here where you had the zero, you get a very reduced, or a reduced, as you have on the nucleosome, you get a reduced number of base pairs per 2 pi. This was already predicted, of course, and is well known. It was predicted in 1978 by Michael Levitt, before there was crystallographic structures known. But my point is just that we can see here we don't even need the base pair to understand this. It's just steric interaction that pushes things apart. To do it completely for the nucleosome, we need to take both the core particle and then also the DNA linker, and we need to make the compromise. So the DNA linker is considered a straight section, and then there's the circle here. That means that it's really slightly smaller than the one I showed before, so it can compensate for the straight sections. And if we do this, I get the numbers are embarrassingly agreeable. 84 from the crystallographic data, 82 angstrom from this simple consideration where there's nothing else than tube interactions. So that was, I think that's the conclusion. I guess it's gotten clear what it is that I mean. That is this combination of having a structure that doesn't rotate when you pull in it with a parking principle that comes from using space most efficiently. I'll just show the next slide, which is some references for those of you who like to take down a reference. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakob. A couple of minutes for questions, Steve.
Yeah, so histone proteins are among the most highly conserved proteins in nature, okay? And I can think of lots of reasons why histones are conserved that unfortunately have nothing to do with DNA. I mean, for one thing, they operate as octamers. So if you mess around with one of the 4 proteins, you potentially disrupt the interactions with the other 3. The other thing is you have to conserve charge distributions on the surfaces of these proteins and so forth. I mean, isn't that likely to be a more important driving force for conservation than simply the organization of the DNA around the particle?
It's up to you to decide that question. But I agree that there can be other reasons for histones, as you mentioned, for the histones to be conserved. I see it somewhat more in a construct that what is suggested here is 2 principles that life would be a lot more difficult for the chromatin fiber if these principles were not obeyed. So it can explain the size in the first place. Why it's then maintained conserved, whether it's one or the other argument, is a little bit more philosophical.
So, sorry, I didn't understand how you picked the diameter of the tube that you use for DNA.
That's a good question, yes.
Okay, so I didn't miss it.
Yes, that's a good question. It's picked from the geometry, essentially.
So what is it? I mean, you published 82 angstroms or something for the...
11 angstrom is what it is, and I don't consider it to be more than 10% accurate. So.
Okay, yeah, right. I see, so you're saying the center will be halfway in.
It's hydrated, at least.
Okay, thank you
Also, I as
very
well.
much, Jakob.